I'm Heather Booth. I was Heather Tobis, so I'm Heather Tobis Booth. My date of birth is December 15th, 1945.
And talk a little bit about us, put us in touch with your family, what it was like, and what inspirations you might have received for your work, the work you've done in your life.
I have two brothers, and the three of us often say to each other how lucky we were to have been born into the family we were born into. Our parents, Hazel Weisbard Tobis and Jerome Sanford Tobis, knew how to give and share love. And so we grew up knowing what love was, and that we were loved, and showed us how we could love other people. And for all the insecurities and fears of our lifetime, and I've had at least my share or more than my share, which is one of the things I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I am grateful for the love and the values of the family I was born into. Not only did my folks believe we should be a good person, and I've tried to be, in general, law-abiding, cross at the green, not in between, I don't litter, but also that we should try to make this a better world. Some relatives going through their files recently have come across various stories or have shared various stories of my folks, who also shared their stories. It's not, we talked about almost everything in our family. And just two examples. One, in a recent talk I was giving, an interviewer had a letter that must be online from my mother when she went to lobby in support of the Northern students who were in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. And it's a letter she wrote me about the response of the government, basically saying they couldn't provide additional support even after the three young volunteers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were killed by the Klan. But she was down there and lobbying and doing what she could.
Where did you grow up, Heather?
I'll tell that in a minute. I want to just tell one other story about my father. He was a physician, and when we were growing up, both my parents had been smokers, and he told us at dinner one night that he was offered a great deal of money to go on TV and be a doctor who would certify that smoking was good for you. And he told us he wasn't going to do that, and crushed his pack of cigarettes and never smoked again. And it was a message to us about not smoking without his saying, you can't smoke, but it was a level of his own commitment, because he said there were scientific studies that weren't yet fully acknowledged, but that smoking was harmful. But those are just two stories. So that's on my family. I was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi, because my father was in the Army in World War II. He worked in a hospital treating patients who had venereal disease, from what I understand. Probably Army personnel. And we quickly moved to New York, to Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, which was largely a Jewish and Italian Catholic community. at the time. And then we moved in a migration that happened for many people in my social circles to the North Shore of Long Island. And we lived in Manhasset, and I went to school in Port Washington. And I was pretty unhappy in those areas. And then moved in, and then in college, I came to Chicago to go to college. And I lived there for 38 years. And then I moved to DC in 1989 and have been living in DC ever since.
Were your brothers older or younger?
I have one older brother and one younger brother.
Okay.
Middle child.
Yes. Yeah. Good.
Tortured by them through my high school years. And I love them dearly.
Were your parents were they involved in politics in any way?
They were part of and were supportive of the social movements of the 40s and 50s in New York, and morally committed. But when we were growing up, my mother was more, she was active in the PTA. She was active in a Jewish community group, I think American Jewish Congress. My father was very active in different medical professional organizations. Toward the end of his life, he ran a nation discussion group. He never really retired, but I'd say in his semi-retirement.
When did you start to get involved in politics?
You know, it depends on different ways you count and think about these things. When I was in high school, my first grade teacher, we already had moved from Brooklyn. My first grade teacher came to visit us. Her name was Mrs. Greenfield. And the reason she tracked me down and visited us is she described how I was in first grade, which I totally did not remember.
Right.
But there was in an all-white class, there was one African-American boy whose name was Benjamin. And one of the girls in the class said that he had stolen her lunch money. And they formed a circle around him and were taunting him, and he was crying. And I went into the circle and put my arm around him. And later on in the day, she found her lunch money in her shoe.
Oh, no.
And so Mrs. Greenfield came out and described that story and how it made an impression on her. So there are some other stories like that, but I could partly say maybe it was always how I was.
Right.
The first, well, in Brooklyn, I had felt very much at home. And then on the North Shore of Long Island, I felt I didn't really fit in. And I so didn't fit in that I fled to New York City almost every weekend. And one of the groups I found was the American Friends Service Committee. And from there, they had demonstrations, or we were handing out flyers. I think this is in the 1950s, end of the 1950s, against the death penalty. And that's the first demonstration I recall being in, or not, it wasn't even a demonstration, it was handing out flyers against the death penalty. Someone was scheduled to be executed in New York. I was extremely frightened, but I had a community to provide support for me in American Friends Service Committee. I also had met some friends in summer camp, two of which of whom I'm still close to now, who are really quite good friends.
Mention their names?
Well, Linda Carver is one. And her story is interesting. Her name now is Linda Hoyes. Her name had been Linda Cohen. And this is relevant about why the name changed.
Mm-hmm.
So she and I became very close friends when I was 8 years old in summer camp. They came to visit my parents, thinking they were not going to like my parents because we lived in a upper middle class house. They were really kind of working class family and did not have a lot of money, and they thought we were going to have heirs and different things. And as they enter, Mr. Carver, whose name had been Mr. Cohen, embraced my mother as my mother, and he realized she had been his student in high school.
Oh my
He
God.
was fired in the red baiting scares because he was accused of being a communist, was fired from his job, and my mother, as a high school student in New Utrecht High School in New York, led a demonstration in support of him. So they changed their name from Cohen to Carver, so they didn't know each other. My mother's name had changed from Weisbard to Tobis. They didn't know each other. And then Linda got married later. Her name was Hoyes, and she's moving on now. My other friend is Annie Popkin, and we met when we were 13. I am extremely close friends with her. And in fact, her husband is now staying at my house for a few days. They now live in Portland, Oregon, because he came in for the Reverend Barber March with a friend of his. So, and for Annie, we were friends as teenagers, lost track of each other, meet on the way to Mississippi in 1964, lose track of each other again. And in the early women's movement, she's part of Bread and Roses in Boston, as well as allied with the Our Bodies, Ourselves Women's Collective, and comes through Chicago, and I'm in the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. So we reconnect then, and we've reconnected at different points in our life. From the Friends Service Committee, I found my way to the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, which did demonstrations in the North in support of the sit-ins at Woolworths in the South, where African Americans weren't allowed to sit at the lunch counters. And from CORE, I found my way to support the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which in the North was called Friends of SNCC. And by the time I went to college, I felt I really found my movement home. I was involved in some other things. I had gone on I went to hear Dr. King speak, and I couldn't find anyone. He spoke in the next community called Great Neck on the North Shore, which was a very liberal, predominantly Jewish community. And I couldn't find anyone to go with me to that talk. I went on a march on Washington against strontium 90 in milk, which was against nuclear testing. And so I was active in a number of things in high school, but I didn't fit in. I was an odd duck. And, but on reaching college, I found my home. So I went to college in 1963. Well, before then, in 1963, on graduating from high school, I went with a friend to Israel and lived on a kibbutz to see what would communal living be like. Was this the remaking of a land? I did not understand the full history of Israel and what's become the occupation of Palestinian territory. But I was on a kibbutz called Lahav, which still exists, and the kibbutz ran an Arab for mayor of Beersheba and had buses that they ran on Saturday. So it was a very small d democratic
Mhm.
participatory kibbutz. But during the summer of 63, I came home to go really, partly this was my country, I'm the US, but I also wanted to be part of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
Within a couple of weeks of going to college, there was a school boycott in the city because the African-American schools were overcrowded. The white schools
And tell us
had
where
vacant classrooms.
and you're in
At-
Chicago.
In what?
Chicago, right?
In Chicago.
At the University of Chicago.
And in the city, the superintendent of schools was Ben Willis. And rather than integrate what would have been neighborhood schools, integrating the Black schools and the white schools, and the Black schools had second class used textbooks. They didn't have often a chemistry lab. They didn't have a pool. A white school might have all of that.
Mhm.
But rather than integrating the schools, he built movable wagons onto the grounds of the Black schools, which then were named Willis wagons, to keep the Black students contained.
Right.
So there was a school boycott called by the civil rights movement for integrated schools. A guy named Meyer Weinberg was the coordinator of it. Al Raby, who was the head of the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations, was a sponsor of it, and SNCC and Friends of SNCC in the North was a coordinator of it. I threw myself into that, and I loved the participation. I loved the impact that it seemed that we were having and the spirit of people together. And one thing led to another, and I was driven for greater involvement. There was then a campaign against a Chicago Mayor Daley machine candidate, Dawson, who was the Black candidate, kind of keeping what we called plantation politics, not really delivering services into the Black community. And there was a campaign against him by A.A. Sammy Rayner. Alice Tregay ran that campaign. I assisted her in the campaign. And I just threw myself into one activity after another, as well as being active on campus, and became head of the Friends of SNCC group, and also joined the student political organization and became head of the student political organization in the student government called the Student Political Action Committee. And then there was an alliance, SDS, Student for Democratic Society, sent 2 organizers to my campus. Steve Max was one of them, and I met him, and we decided to join, our student political committee decided to join SDS. And Bob Ross and Lee Webb, who were on my campus, were amongst the people I connected with for that alliance. And one of my teachers, Dick Flax, was also in the founding group of SDS, as were Steve Max, Bob Ross, Lee Webb, and then my future husband, who I didn't know at the time, Paul Booth. With that connection, in 1963, probably still, our campus was visited by 2 representatives from SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Casey Hayden and Dee Gordon. And they described the summer project that was developing. And I wanted to go. I signed up. There was a whole application process. I almost wasn't accepted. I think Dee thought I didn't have the maturity to go. And I was also interviewed by an African-American member of SNCC, Curtis Muhammad. His name then was Curtis Hayes, and he thought I should go. So I ended up being allowed to go. I was 18 years old. You had to raise $500 to go. It was an enormous amount of money. I
Mhm.
did everything I could. I went door to door. I went back to the synagogue I was brought up in. Um, by the way, that's also probably relevant.
Mhm.
Feeling I didn't belong in high school, I at one point wanted to be a rabbi, and I was told women couldn't be rabbis. I wanted to get a bar mitzvah. I didn't even know there was a bat mitzvah, which women would get. Um, but women were confirmed, and I was confirmed in the book of Amos, and my rabbi was a social justice rabbi.
Okay.
And so I had other things in my background that led me more and more in this direction. I also had gone to a summer camp, Putney summer camp, where um, I read left-wing and progressive uh, material, uh, as well as went hiking, worked on a farm, uh, and saw a culture of people trying to make this into a better world. So that brings me up to in Chicago in 64, I go to Mississippi. I return to my campus in 65. I don't know if you want me to describe Mississippi.
I think you should. I think that would be helpful. And your parents were obviously willing to have you go.
Well, the first and maybe the only big conflict I ever recall having with my parents was the night that I spoke to them before I left for Mississippi. It had just been reported that day that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were missing and presumed dead.
Yeah.
And they were so frightened. My mother was so frightened she couldn't talk on the phone. She could only cry.
Right.
And I loved them dearly and actually felt I was carrying out their values.
Right.
And my father, who was so gentle, was yelling in the phone, "How could you do this? Are they going to teach you how to use a gun? Will you know how to kill?" And it was just so painful.
Mhm.
And he must have been just so frightened. In
Mhm.
fact, later, he ended up helping to form the medical committee that supported the civil rights movement, the Medical Committee for Human Rights.
Mhm.
And he was in amongst the founding signatories of that group. So I knew he had the commitment, which actually I didn't find out during that summer, only later.
Mhm.
But I was 18 and they didn't stop me from going.
Right.
And they went to, I also had an aunt who had fought as a nurse, was a nurse in the Spanish Civil War. And I felt there was a comparison that sometimes you risk your life, though I very much wanted to live,
Right.
but for a cause that you really believe in, if that's what's needed.
Mhm.
I went to Mississippi. I was in 3 towns. The first was Rollville, the second was Shaw, and the third was Cleveland. Each one had a remarkable history. In Rollville, that's where Ms. Hamer lived, Fannie Lou Hamer. And part of her story is she had been a sharecropper. And when she told the landowner that she was going to vote, he said he was going to throw her family off the land. The house belonged to them.
Hmm.
The store they bought food in belonged to the landowner. And the landowner said, if she goes to vote, to register, he will throw her off the land. And she said to him, "I'm registering for myself, not for you." And they were thrown off the land, but it's just an act of the level of courage
Right.
that she had. And after she registered, she was beaten in a jail where she was arrested and was lame for the rest of her life, but went on to become the co-chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was formed when it was clear that the white establishment was not going to allow voter registration of African Americans, who I believe at that point would have been the majority of the vote in Mississippi had they been allowed to vote. I then went to Shaw, and there's a fairly famous picture now that Wally Roberts, who was the head of my freedom school, took of me playing the guitar at 18 for Fannie Lou Hamer in front of her house with two of her friends. I then went to Shaw. I stayed with the Hawkins family, with Mary Lou and Andrew Hawkins. And their story is so remarkable. Much of it I didn't know at the time, but not only had he helped to build a sharecroppers union, but he testified before Congress about the need for sharecroppers to make more than a few cents. And not only did he take in several volunteers, white volunteers, into Shaw, but he sued the town of Shaw in a case that went to the Supreme Court, and they won. And the case, many people think, is as important as Brown versus Board of Education.
What was the name of the case, Heather?
It's Shaw versus Hawkins.
Okay.
Though there were some other families involved. And what he did is an analysis of, with legal help, what were the accommodations in the Black part of town versus the white part of town. The Black part of town had no paved streets or sewer system or street lights or very little indoor plumbing. It had outhouses. There were no, and the white part of town had all of that, and tennis courts and a pool. And he won. Later on, after the summer, because of his activism, his home was firebombed twice. And on the second time, a son, Andrew Jr., and two of his grandchildren were killed. And daughters were burned, were scarred for life. And later, a policeman in town challenged, shot, and killed Mrs. Hawkins. So you have 4 people in one family who were killed, and almost no one knows about it. There has been a celebration by Benny Thompson, who's the congressman from that area, the one Black congressman remaining in Mississippi. And they got a piece of the highway renamed in the name of the Hawkins family, and they had a celebration of him and are trying to recognize him. There are other stories from Mississippi. It also was the first time I was arrested for supporting a voting rights demonstration. And then, so I want to say the takeaways I had from Mississippi. And in Cleveland, that was the town that Amzie Moore was in. And he was the person who saw the importance of doing voter registration as the focus, as opposed to either housing or employment, as important as that was, but to create a basis for political power. The 3 big takeaways that I had from Mississippi, while being scared for my life and scared that for the lives of others, that I would harm others. One was because within a year we won a Voting Rights Act. I learned that if you organize, you can change the world, but you've got to organize. 2, sometimes you have to stand up to illegitimate authority. And 3 is that you need to trust local people. You need to listen to what they say, that how courageous and smart they were about what they needed for their lives. And those lessons, I've tried to stay true to them for the rest of my life. So that's I mean, there would be a longer story if this was on civil rights. Right. So those are lessons I took from Mississippi.
Yes.
And took back to Chicago.
Right.
Where I was very active. I was head of Friends of SNCC. I was active in the student government, but I was also active in the Folklore Society, in the theater group.
So you're now in your sophomore year, is that correct? Because that was
and I'm now going into my sophomore year. And
what were you studying at the university? What was your major?
Undergraduate was social sciences.
Okay.
And
When you had time to study, I realize it's.
No, I actually studied a lot. I was a very studious person. I graduated with many more credits than you need even.
Mhm. Okay.
And then, so that's 64. And I then was doing national traveling for SNCC nationally and Friends of SNCC in the North and speaking about it and trying to raise money.
Okay.
We raised money for Dick Gregory, did a big event on our campus, the very socially pointed and conscious comedian. And then 64, and then into 65, to give a sense of life on our campus. There were different hours for women and men on campus.
Right.
When you could come in, there were parietal hours. The part of what was developing in the country as a whole was not only did the civil rights movement provide an impetus for all movements in the country,
Mhm.
and also there was a rising middle class. So even for people who were poor and even with discrimination, there was some more spendable income. So you could sit at a lunch counter and try to eat. You could have money to pay for a bus.
Good point.
And there was a rising middle class who had disposable income. And youth had some disposable income, as well as there was colleges were a new socializing force in the country. And for the first time, a majority of college age population, I believe, was in college of some kind.
Mhm.
The result was there was a youth movement developing that had some disposable income,
Mhm.
some additional education, and some socializing experience separate from the families and the congregations and the neighborhoods that they originally grew up in, and were learning different things. So every movement in the society had an adult movement and a student movement. It was a time of movements. There was a civil rights movement, let's say NAACP and Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a church-based organization. And there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had women's organization. Women were in all organizations, but a youth organization. But also during the summer project, there was a paper circulated that Casey Hayden and Mary King circulated that was called On the Woman Question. And it raised the issue of how come, if we're so active in all these organizations, why aren't we in the leadership positions more often? Though there was some attempt from it with SNCC and the civil rights movement, and that's why I mentioned that Fannie Lou Hamer and Ed King were the co-chairs of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Mhm.
I get back to my campus. The campus has what are called parietal hours, functioning in loco parentis, in lieu of parents. The campus is governing young people, and women had to come in at 11, men could come in at midnight. There were separate dorms then for men and women. I had been trying to comfort and support a friend of mine who was had just been in a broken love affair, love relationship, broken romance. And I came in after 11, and I was investigated for birth control pills, and they looked into my purse, and I felt so violated. I felt, just think of the innocent time. How could you think that I would have birth control pills? That was at that moment.
Right.
And then a teacher, Naomi Weistein, was an extraordinary neurobiologist and later got many, many accolades, more articles in Science magazine than I think Nobel Prize winners. And she was on campus and a teacher, but she wasn't allowed to be on a tenured track because her husband, Jesse Leamish, who was a history teacher and had been one of my history teachers, teaching history from the bottom up. He wrote a book called Jack Tar about a view of the American Revolution from the view of a naval shipman, someone just on the boat. But Jesse could be on a tenured track, but Naomi couldn't because what they call the nepotism rule. So I organized demonstrations against that. And in 1965, so this was bubbling up.
Right.
In 1965, there was a meeting in December in Champaign-Urbana of SDS. And my professor, Dick Flax, as I said, was in the founding group of SDS, suggested that I go to that because they were going to discuss the woman question.
Ah.
During that meeting, and I didn't really know people there, I was intimidated in almost everything I've ever done. I am in many ways an insecure person, and it's become part of my own philosophy of how you act and how you treat people, believing that people are not confident and that we act out of our lack of confidence, either to fall victim to it and say, I'm a victim, I'm no good, I can't do anything. And you become a victim and have a sadder life. Or you deny it. You say, I did it, you can do it. And you can become a kind of bully.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can live with that insecurity and know everyone is insecure. Everyone feels we're not good enough. We don't know enough. The society tells us you're not smart enough. You're not pretty enough. You're not enough. And that rather than denying it, to say, look, we all may feel that way, but together we are stronger. I mention it because I once almost wrote a book about this. It was going to be called Organizing Women, but it was about women organizers. I was going to write it with an author who was an established author, Joyce Kornblum.
Mm-hmm.
But she then, and I did all the research. I spoke to many women leaders. Mary Jean, I probably spoke to you as one of the leaders, but I spoke to Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan, and I spoke to Gloria Steinem, and I spoke to grassroots organizers. This is later. This was in the 70s that I did this study. And then Joyce said she couldn't write the book. She had to do something else. She was occupied. And though I had done a lot of the research in the interviews, I wasn't confident enough to write the book on my own. And so I never wrote the book, but I have many theories, and it's informed my entire view of how you build supportive organization and what I now call the need to have love at the center of our organizing. But going back to the SDS meeting in 1965, there are a few hundred people having this discussion about the woman question. And it's going on for hours, as many of these movement meetings did, interminable. And at one point, one of the SNCC organizers, Jimmy Garrett, who had been a friend, got up with two of his friends, one of the Black organizers, and said, look, you women aren't going to get it together unless you talk amongst yourselves. And so he was leaving. And as he left, I thought at that moment, oh no, Black and white together, men and women together. Oh no, we can make this work. Another hour goes by and the women are just being denied. One woman says, I don't think you listen to me. And a man says, oh no, that's not true. We listened. It's like, and at that point, I took a group of women and we met and talked and agreed would come back to our home base, in my case, Chicago, and organized women's discussion groups that became part of consciousness raising groups. Back on campus, several things happened. I'm a little bit confused on the sequence, but there was a conversation on my campus where, while I'm talking, a guy who has since died, but a guy, while I'm talking in the group, and I was very active, I was doing the work, I was a leader on campus, and he says, ah, shut up. Mm. I was so shocked that he would treat anyone that way, but also that he'd treat me that way. So after I was done talking, I tapped every woman on the shoulder and I said, let's go upstairs. We were in the Ida Noyes student lounge. And we went upstairs and we formed the WRAP, the Women's Radical Action Program. And the name was taken because there had been ERAP projects, which were the community organizing efforts of SDS. And there was one in Chicago called Join, Jobs or Income Now, that organized in a white Appalachian area, but there was one in Newark, Tom Hayden was part of that. There was one in Oakland. There were a number of these around the country. And so we were forming Women's Radical Action Project, and it was the RAP group, which I think was the first campus women's liberation organization in the country. And we did a number of things from that group. One was a study of what we called significant response. So we just wanted to know, women felt invisible in classes. And our own insecurity was reinforced if you feel invisible, if you're treated as invisible. So we measured how often did a teacher, and almost many of the teachers were disproportionately men.
Right.
I'd be actually interested to know, but I bet the students were too, but I don't know what the balance was at that point. Okay. So a teacher might say, William, what do you think? And William says something, and the teacher might say, oh, that was very insightful, William, and you might consider this. Robert, what do you think? And then Robert might say something, and teacher would say, oh, I think you've missed the main point, and have a back and forth. Susan, what do you think? George, what do you think? And there was just no interaction. And we called it significant response. There was a 4-to-1 significant response to men students versus women students. Okay. So we then trained the women students and would prepare for classes, and people would say, okay, they're going to discuss Thucydides. Why don't we prepare a little? And when you go in, what were you going to say? I was going to say this. Okay, can we reinforce it? Or then in the class would say, oh, I thought what Susan said was very interesting. Can we go back to Susan's point? So we were reinforcing each other. Good. And then we asked the teachers to provide time in the class to review the study that we had done. Because after all, we were students in a university whose theme was the life of the mind. So we were talking about our research. Right. And we did other things. We had demonstrations, and we're supporting what was becoming an emerging women's movement. So that was 65. In 65, also a friend of mine, and this story now is very well known, that a friend of mine was told me that his sister was pregnant and nearly suicidal and wanted an abortion. And I hadn't thought about the issue before, but he asked me, could I help her find someone to provide an abortion? And I didn't really know anything about this, but I went to the medical arm of the civil rights movement, MCHR, that I mentioned before. Quentin Young, who lived in Chicago, had initiated. And my father, I only learned around this time, had also helped to support. And I found a doctor, Dr. T.R.M. Howard. He is an amazing story. He had been a civil rights leader, Black civil rights leader in Mississippi, until his name appeared on a planned death list, because he did such things as stand up for the investigation of the murder of Emmett Till, who was a teenager from Chicago who was visiting his aunt in Mississippi, when a white woman in a store said he had whistled at her. Years later, she recanted and said he hadn't even whistled at her. But his battered body was shown first in African-American magazines like Jet, and then shown around the country. And his mother, Mamie Mosley, had the courage to say his battered body should be shown so that people could see what it meant. And it had a profound effect on me. The original picture of, this is years before, of Emmett Till's murder. And I know there were a number of white people in the North who were deeply affected by that, because it brought home what the brutality and terror that existed about racial discrimination. So Dr. Howard came to Chicago. I didn't know this at the time, but he set up a clinic on 63rd Street, and it called Friendship Clinic. I only learned that many years later. But he agreed to the procedure. It was going to be $500. I made the arrangement, and mostly I gave the information to my friend, and I thought that was it.
Right.
I thought it was simply an act of goodwill, something you do for a friend, the golden rule, you treat others as you want to be treated. And I was just going to move on, when then someone else called, and either my friend or the woman involved told someone else, who, because I wasn't talking about it.
Right.
And I made the arrangement again, and then someone else called. And when someone else, by that time, I realized, gee, there's a need. I better set up a system. And so those 3 rules that I learned from Mississippi, that you need to organize and take action if you want to change the world, that you need to stand up to illegitimate authority, and that you need to listen to what people need. And I didn't realize it at the time, but after, this was before Roe, which was 1973, I didn't know that 3 people talking about an abortion was a conspiracy to commit felony murder. I knew it wasn't legal, so I wasn't talking about it.
Right.
Over time, I'll finish the story on Jane and then go on, but over time, more and more women were coming through. And I'll tell later, but by 1966, I met the person who was going to be my husband. We got married in 67. We had our first child in 68. So I was pregnant with my first child. I was in grad school, and I was also working, and I couldn't manage it. And so and more women were coming through. So I recruited other women into what became, we called the service. And because we were telling people to call at a time when it was illegal, the decision was to say, call Jane. And so it was called the service, or Jane. And over time, there were about 100 women who were in Jane, who did the initially counseling, and then were providing assistance. Dr. Howard was no longer in touch. I didn't know what had happened to him, but it turned out he had been arrested for providing an abortion.
Oh.
But he didn't turn me in, so it just shows what a remarkable person he was. I found someone else. His name was Mike. The procedures were going on. I had learned what was involved in the abortions. What do you do before? What do you do after? Is it painful? How do you support the women? How do you follow up with them? And I passed all that information on to about 12 women who I recruited to carry on this service. Over time, so many women were coming through. At the height, maybe 100 a week would be signed up wanting an abortion.
Mhm.
And Mike decided at some point he was going to leave doing the work. The women were already assisting. And then it turned out Mike wasn't a doctor. At that point, the women felt if he could do it, they could do it.
Mhm.
And so the women learned how to do the abortions and performed over 11,000 abortions before Roe. There's much more to the story. There's now several movies about it. There's a recent HBO film called The Janes. There's a Sigourney Weaver kind of Hollywood version of it that's culturally quite effective, though not a documentary. The name of that is Call Jane, and Sigourney Weaver plays a combination version of two of the women who really headed it up while they were doing the procedures, and me, only in that I started it, but it's a composite vision.
Mhm.
There's another movie called She's Beautiful When She's Angry that Mary Dorr made, whose husband is Ethan Young, who's the son of Quentin Young. And another film that was made on my life in organizing called Heather Booth Changing the World that Lily Rivlin made, that was made about Jewish women activist and cultural figures. She made a series of films on those themes. There's another film called Jane, an Abortion Story, and there actually is a book, a play, movie, other movies about Jane that's gained increasing visibility as the Supreme Court is about to make its decision.
Right.
So there's that. Just a couple more things in college, and then we get to post-college.
Okay.
And I've told this story a fair amount, and that is that it actually happened later, but a friend of mine was raped at knife point in off-campus housing. And when we went with her to get a gynecological exam, she was told that student health didn't cover gynecological exams, and she was given a lecture on her promiscuity.
Mhm.
And we sat with her. It was called a sit-in. And over time, because people organized, of course, you'd say you now get not only gynecological coverage, you get comforting care. You're told in your orientation about, men are trained about rape and what's consent. And there's a whole cultural and legal change. The rise of the Me Too movement and other things, but it's only because people took action and organized. Nothing is natural if there's not this approach. So that goes through college. There are other examples, other things that happened. I helped to start the first campus-initiated women's groups and taught it with Naomi Weisstein, and also with a woman who I became very close to, Marlene Dixon, who then wasn't allowed tenure. I went into graduate school. I went on an NDEA fellowship, which means that a National Defense Education Act believed that people like me should have a full fellowship to go to grad school. It paid for everything for me. And originally Marlene Dixon was my advisor. She was not retained, she was not given tenure, and so was leaving the university. And so I started over again. I changed schools and majors. I went into educational psychology. My theme was on democracy in the classroom. I did all my research and finished all my classes. And my doctorate professor went to England for a year. When he came back, this was before the internet, before Zoom, and so we were in touch only by carbon copy papers that would,
Yes.
letters would send to each other. I finished the research, I finished all my classes, and in our first meeting, my subject is democracy in the classroom. What forms of teaching engage students or don't? I actually think I came up with some interesting insights just about engagement, about whether students were bored or not, and what it did to students. And his comment to me was, democracy is spoiled when it's given to the masses. He was the head of the lab school at the university, I think. And I realized I would have to start again. So this would be the second time I would be starting. I had it. I couldn't keep going. I was a teaching assistant. I was teaching some classes already, or sections of classes. And I decided to leave the university. I gave my materials to another friend who got her master's at the University of Illinois. And so I was no longer going to be teaching. Meanwhile, I had been, in '66, there was a sit-in at the university against the war in Vietnam. I was a campus activist and helped to design the sit-in. The university was ranking male students in rank order and was grade point average order, and would give that to the selective service. We knew there was a relationship between race and class and grade point average. We felt the university shouldn't be cooperating or collaborating with the selective service. We had a petition about it. It started to rain. We went into the administration building. We sat down. It went on for several days. We invited an outside speaker whose name was Paul Booth, who was the National Secretary of SDS, which was based in Chicago. Paul came over. He says he was looking for me, a former boyfriend, who actually was the guy who told me his sister was pregnant. Said he should look for me. Paul sat next to me. 3 days later, he asked me to marry him. We were talking. And after 5 days, I said I would. We'd wait for a year, and we got married in 1967, the week I graduated from college.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of, that was college. Then I was teaching at a school for the Loop YMCA high school. It was a school for dropouts, thrown outs, and people under court supervision. And Amy Kesselman taught there, and Robin Kaufman did, who were also two friends from the women's movement. And a number of things happened at the school also, but one of them just on the women's issues. At school, I did student-initiated classes. We took the kids to see the conspiracy trial. It was I did political education with the Black Panthers, who formed a grouping at the school. And when I asked for a leave, for a pregnancy leave for my first child, which was only going to be 6 weeks leave, it was actually, with a summer vacation, would have been, and it was 4 to 6 weeks that I was going to take. When I returned, the principal, who I had had many run-ins, we tried to form a union and other things, wouldn't let me come back because it was not part of the law that you had to be allowed to take a maternity leave. Even though he had given me a verbal agreement, I didn't have it in writing. It just shows that life changed. Now it's against the law to fire someone who takes a maternity leave.
Right.
So during that time, I don't remember the years, but there was so I had been forming these consciousness raising groups in Chicago in 1968, there was a national conference for new politics.
Mhm.
And Paul, my husband, was actually a lead staffer, or maybe the lead staffer for it. A guy named Pepper was the head of it. And it was designed to have a national convening to run a King Spock ticket, Dr. Spock and Dr. King, for president and vice president. Not that they had accepted it, but that was the purpose of it.
Right.
That weekend became a very complicated weekend because my brother was getting married that weekend. It was early September 1968. There were the negotiations. My husband worked for the packing house workers,
Mhm.
and there were the swift negotiations in the same hotel as the convention, and he was the lead researcher for the packing house workers. So a lot was going on. My brother was getting married in New York, so I couldn't be at the conference, even though I'd helped to organize for it. Oh, this was in 67, because it was to prepare for the 68 election.
Okay.
During that convention, it was the first time there was a Black caucus that had non-negotiable demands. The convention ended up in dissolution. It was not, and very contentious. But one of the things that happened is that Shulamith Firestone and Joe Freeman
Okay.
had been at a women's caucus. I wasn't there because I was in New York at my brother's wedding.
Right.
Though I knew Joe prior,
Mhm.
and knew Shulamith Firestone prior. And I may have the sequence mixed up, but I don't think we had been meeting as a group before, but we may have been.
Okay.
And they called for a resolution of the women's caucus. A woman named Shirley Lenz introduced a fairly conventional women in support role resolution that was accepted. Shulamith Firestone kept trying to raise her hand and say, we have another resolution. They weren't recognized. And when they went up to Pepper afterwards and said, you didn't recognize us, how could you do this? He basically said, go away, little girl.
Huh?
Joe and Shuli were so furious that they decided to organize, and we formed what was the West Side Group. I was a very active part of that, and that's why it's possible the West Side Group was formed before, but it was one of the first women's liberation organizations in the country. In fact, I'm sure, Mary Jean, there's a way in which, if just for fact checking, it may be that this was as early as 65 or 66.
Okay.
So it's worth fact checking, but it at least was by 67. And so we called the West Side Group. We met at Joe's house, and the women in it included Naomi Weisstein, Shulamith Firestone, her sister Leah. Shuli later wrote The Dialectics of Sex. Amy Kesselman was in the group, Vivian Rothstein. And there were about 15 or 20 women in the group. And from that group, we also formed other groups, consciousness raising groups and other action groups. And I had started the Chicago Women's the RAP group on campus that also had then community groups that we were forming.
Right.
So that, and then the group would have both internal political discussions, you know, is Jackie Kennedy more our sister, or what does sisterhood mean? What's the role of class and race? And across differences. We convened a demonstration at Playboy. We had a little sign that said, "This abuses women," or something like that. And they were stickers, and we'd stick them on people. We stick them on posters
Right.
that we thought abused women. And so that's 66, 67. 68, I was teaching. 69, I got another job. I was in grad school till 73.
Okay.
And I got a job at a group called Urban Research.
Right.
I was treated very well. I had 2 little kids. They let me basically come and go as I wanted. I was an editor. I was in graduate school. I was still trying to get the doctorate. I left with a master's, but I was trying to get my doctorate then. But the clericals, which were all black, were really not treated fairly, though there was a liberal head of it. And one day when I came to work, one of the clerical women was crying when I asked her why. She said her pay had just been cut and she didn't have enough to support her and her daughter. She was a single mom and she was going to quit. And I said, well, why was it cut? Because the woman who used to sit next to her was going to become her supervisor and needed a salary increase. But this had not been discussed at all. So I said, don't quit. Let's make a list of concerns. They were all non-financial concerns. What is the sick leave policy? I could come and go on sick leave. All I had to do was call and notify people. Others didn't know what the sick leave policy was.
Right.
What is there a procedure if you have an issue so you can even discuss issues like this? And we had 10 issues that were all non-financial, but were about process. Management said they would agree to all the demands, but I had to be fired, that I was treating them like GM.
Oh.
I was in tears. Oh, there's another issue I think that's relevant. I'm sorry that I left out about my hospital organizing. So, and I didn't know what to do. We had no money. My husband didn't have a job. We had 2 little kids. I did have the grad school fellowship, but we had almost no money.
Right.
And I was encouraged to file an NLRB suit. 2.5 years later, I won that suit. And with that money, I started Midwest Academy. There are 2, which Mary Jean Collins was on the first board of, because I had already connected with NOW by 1970. But there are 3 things I want to say that bring us to 1970.
Okay.
In 1966, 65 and 66, as I'm in, or 66 and 67, when I'm in my senior year of college, there's a joint civil rights labor organizing drive to organize 50 hospitals in the city. And I became a full-time nurse's aide while I was a senior. My professor was Dick Flax, who let me get college credit for a report I would write about my experience organizing. There's a whole set of lessons I learned from that. I did organize it. I had over 50% signed up on cards, which is very hard in a union situation when in a hospital where there's a lot of turnover. The one day I go downstairs and I see there's someone handing out cards that have the same name we're called help, the same name as our card, but there's a different address and they weren't my cards. I had cards I was giving out internally, secretly on staff. And it was a joint SEIU Teamster organizing effort when the Teamsters and SEIU had a handshake deal with the mayor and not a robust union activity. And it was a raid. I call up my contact and say, what's happened? And they say, oh my God, we didn't know you were still inside. We didn't know you were still organizing. The plan was to have a strike on Labor Day across 50 hospitals. And that's what I was building toward. And we didn't know you were still inside. We've called off the drive because one of the organizers, Jean Tenor, one of the coordinators who came out of CORE, was charged with being a communist. And the anti-communism of the labor movement meant that they call off the drive because of that. So that was an education. There's one thing I wanted to mention. The second thing, as we're getting to 73, is so I'm in women's liberation. There's a national conference on women's liberation. And there's the Lake Villa conference, and I've actually now gotten them confused which was which. But again, Mary Jean, I don't know if you, but someone could check the date. There are two conferences.
Absolutely.
One was a national women's liberation conference. One was in 1968, because I went with a newborn child of, maybe he was 3 months old. Jean, my oldest child, was born, and his name is Jean Victor, after Eugene Victor Debs, was born in July of 1968. And, so after I'd gotten married, 3 months later, the Selective Service came to our house looking in trench coats like FBI or something, and basically said my husband would get a, they'd
Draft notice?
draft him into the army, but this was a notice. It wasn't his draft number. They'd draft him into the army because of his leadership in the student movement,
Oh
in the
my
anti-war movement. He had headed up the first march against the war in Vietnam.
God. Okay.
But one of the ways that you could get out of the army is if you didn't have a student deferment, and he hadn't taken one because he felt they were discriminatory, if you could have a child. And at first I said, no, go into the army, fight from within. He said, are you crazy? I said, go to jail and I'll move up. There's a women's commune that's in New Haven, in New England. I'll move up to the women's commune. He said, no. So I take to my women's group, should we have a child? They say yes. And then when I had a child, no one would accept us. I couldn't nurse in the group. The child was distracting.
Oh my-
Remember, we were so young, almost very few had children at that point. Many had bad experiences in their birth family. I had a good experience, but it meant we didn't know how to deal with children. Many of us were not much more than
You're barely children.
people ourselves. So, but I brought my child to this, I think it was the Lake Villa National Conference,
Okay.
but I may be getting these two mixed up. And I couldn't nurse in the room. I had to nurse in the dormitory.
Right.
And one of the women who was in Jane then told me recently that in the group, I'm about to speak, and I turned to her and give her my child and say, could you hold him? I'm about to speak. So there was a sisterhood.
Right.
And the early women's movement was just filled with sisterhood, and it was part of the great joy in my life.
Right.
So there was a Lake Villa conference that formed was a national gathering
Yes.
of people from women's liberation, including Red Stockings in New York. There was a group in California. There was a group in the South, I think in Chapel Hill. A lot of them were campus-based. It was the youth-based part of a women's movement. And then there was a second conference, and that was the conference to form the Chicago Women's Liberation Union.
Right.
And during this time, we were already doing actions. We had a guerrilla theater group called Witch, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. We would,
Yes. No.
run into the AMA conference and tell them how medicine was controlling our lives, and we'd be dressed like witches and then run out. Or we did one on the commodities exchange? No, the mercantile exchange about that was in Chicago. We did one at the University of Chicago. We did a number of these guerrilla theater. And then formed the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, which really was my base organization for many years. And we had two kinds of groups. We had a home group, which was our discussion group, and where we took personal and social and political discussion issues, and then work groups.
Mhm.
So at one point, my home group, which had Christine Ridio, I think at one point Margaret Schmidt was in one. I was in a couple of different home groups. One was called Brazen Hussies, to play on the name if you're a brazen hussy. I didn't actually even know what a hussy was. Someone told me.
Yeah.
And then the work group, I was in Action Committee for Decent Childcare by 67. By 68, when I was having my first child, we decided to, I tried to build a childcare center. And we finally built one called Sojourner Truth in a Unitarian church that was across the street from where I lived on 50th and Dorchester.
Mm.
But the regulations in the city were such that you couldn't basically get a childcare center built. It's partly that there had been the Our Lady of Angels church had a fire and children were killed in it because there had been inadequate regulations. But what they did then is they gave the control of the regulations to two contractors. So it was very expensive to build childcare, and including that they had rules you couldn't build below grade, below ground. So you couldn't build it in a church basement. You had to have a generator, not just a sign that said exit that was in, that could glow in the dark.
Right.
But you had to have rules that were not needed for the safety of children. And it meant that two contractors could make a lot of money, but women were re-entering the workforce. They needed more childcare, and there was no city-funded childcare in Chicago. So we built an organization. We called it the Action Committee for Decent Childcare. And over time, we won. First of all, it was multiracial. It was Black and white, 50-50, which was quite remarkable for those days.
Yes.
And we were very self-conscious about doing it.
Mhm.
And we worked with the YWCA, Day Creamer, who was one of my closest friends then. We finally won a revision of childcare licensing laws, a panel of parents and childcare operators that could control and review the budget. So we had community control on it. And then we also won $1 million for childcare when that was a lot of money.
A lot of money.
And so, and those embodied the principles. I realize I've left out a number of things. So I'm going to go back.
Okay.
That during the labor organizing drive and the hospital organizing drive, one of the people who was a researcher for the effort was Pat Novick.
Mhm.
She then married Al Raby,
Mhm.
who was the head of the CCCO, the Community Council on Community Organizations.
Mhm.
And I was the youth liaison to that because I was head of Friends of SNCC on campus.
Mhm.
I was also in Friends of SNCC in the city, which was quite remarkable. And Fanny Rushing was the staffer, so there was a woman staffer. There were co-chairs, Sylvia Fisher and Monroe Sharp. So there was men and women. There was a consciousness about that within SNCC and Friends of SNCC. Even things weren't fully equal, but it was more conscious.
Mhm.
And Pat and I stayed friends. And then after Paul and I got married and we had our first child, and Al and Pat got married, we moved into the same apartment on 50th and Dorchester.
Okay.
And we had nothing. Everyone had a bed, a spindly chair. We had a table on which we could eat. We had a little table in the kitchen, and we had Al's pool table up front. That was the one beautiful thing in the whole house, because he had been a kind of a street hustler before, but he was a remarkable person. And that friendship with Pat still sustains, and Pat was part of the Jane Network, and she and I are still very close friends. So that's 67, 68. By 1970, Mary Jean Collins and some other people from NOW, I was in touch with them. Oh, I know that at the urban research company where I worked and then had been fired, and I guess, oh, that's a little later. But anyway, Susan Davis worked there, and she tried to create a national women's news magazine that would have been called Womankind. And for issues of control, they ended up not accepting the financial deal that had been arranged, but I would have been an editor of Womankind. Susan and I are still friends, by the way. She now lives in Ecuador.
Oh, she does.
And has a remarkable international network. So many of these friendships have endured.
Yes.
By 1970, Mary Jean Collins and others, but I think it was a connection perhaps with Susan Davis that led me to now. I met Mary Jean and fell in love with her the minute I met her, as I think most people did and do. She also came out of the civil rights movement with Father Groppe in Milwaukee. We had a fire, a positive spirit. She was engaging. She believed in organizing. I learned from her. I love her. And she connected me with NOW. And in 1970, when there was the big
August 26th.
The women's strike, August 26th, we had someone from the Action Committee for Decent Childcare speak.
You.
By the way, Action Committee for Decent Childcare was ACDC.
I know, it was you.
And so, you know, we were trying to show we're for everyone.
Right.
And partly I want to mention it because the parts of the movement don't remember that there were other things going on. I think Pat Novick was our speaker from the childcare effort at the August 26th demonstration. But on seeing it and seeing more people than I could imagine.
Totally.
And then Mary Jean, I may also be mixing up these dates, but that there was a woman from Kraft Foods. Oh, we had helped to organize Women Employed. Oh, no, that was later. But there was a woman from Kraft Foods who was thrown out of her job because she took her daughter to work. And you went down to Kraft Foods. Was that the same day, August 26th, or was it a different day?
It was another. It wasn't Kraft Foods, but the incident happened that she took her daughter to work, but it was a different company. Morel. I think it was Morel. Oh. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, we marched over there. Judy Lawrence.
That you marched over there. This was the exact spirit that it was like I found my sister. I found lots of sisters in the movement. Amy Kesselman, who I'm still in touch with. We are on a monthly call. Vivian Rothstein, Vivian and Amy and I are on a monthly call together. There are many of these people who are deep connections.
Right.
But on seeing NOW's explosion in the country, this was the leading thrust of the movement. And so, though I was in Women's Liberation, which was the youth branch, we didn't see it that way, but that was my core, I decided to make an alliance between the two if we couldn't even merge the two. They were culturally different enough.
They were.
Some of the issues were different. And I loved the Women's Liberation Union at that point, 1970. We had a women's liberation school that Vivian fostered. There was an organizing of youth organizing that Amy helped to foster. There was a graphics collective that Estelle Carroll did. I mean, it was a very robust and great operation. And NOW, it had a group that looked at textbooks. It had a group that looked at sex education. It had a group that, and we all worked also with a Loop Y. So it was sort of a parent entity,
Yes,
institution that helped us all. And we were all friends together.
we were.
But not everyone was a friend together. And not everyone felt that those cultural mixes would work. And over time, that rift with the Women's Liberation Union became greater and greater. And the Women's Liberation Union faced left sectarian battles, in part that became quite visible in public with the destruction of SDS, with the creation both of what was called the RIM 2 direction and Weatherman. And then, so that by the 1966, by 1967, Paul and I left SDS.
Oh, okay.
We had gone to a Clear Lake, Iowa conference, and on driving back, two things happened. One, there was an expose that the National Student Association and SDS had in part formed out of that. It had been a meeting place where SDS helped it form, that it had been controlled by the CIA and had CIA operatives in it, and that there were also police informers who were living with people from SDS and destroying the organization from within. There also became both left sectarians coming into it, and then the organization had such growth over time that it was too fast and you couldn't acculturate people adequately. And so there became divisions that, had we had time or experience to integrate better, perhaps we could have overcome. But they were really a crisis of democracy, and I felt both the organization was becoming mean-spirited and undemocratic in the name of democracy. So anyone could come to a meeting and vote, but it meant you didn't have to have been active. So you didn't do the work, but you voted.
Right.
And later on, that very principle was part of the undermining of NOW.
Yes.
And was part of the way in which we then tried to save the Women's Liberation Union, saying you could only come to a meeting facing these left sectarian fights if you had done the work and had been in it for a length of time. But that decision to set those rules created a division within the Women's Liberation Union, because it meant we were going to have rules. It meant some people would be excluded. And that decision, and I wasn't skillful enough to know how to navigate the inclusion of people while we're trying to make this decision, while we're working full time, while I have two little kids.
Totally.
And the result was the Women's Liberation Union started to fracture. The SDS certainly fractured by 1968. There were metal detectors to see if you were carrying weapons to go into its convention. We were out of it by that point, though I went to the convention. It was a horror show. And with all of these groups fracturing, with the money that I won from the back pay suit from Urban Research, I started a training center, Midwest Academy. And it was the third time I was fired for organizing. I'd been fired at where I was teaching from Urban Research and from another place that I had worked. And I decided I couldn't ever be fired again. We had no money.
Right.
And so I started a training center for organizers. Mary Jean was on the first board. Mary Brumder, who has since died, who worked at South Shore Bank, was on the first board. Paul Booth was on the board. Bob Creamer, Jay Creamer was on the board. It was a group of friends. And the academy is still going on. And the first training was to train women organizers. I had been hired by a group of social workers to write a manual for organizing women, and we called it direct action organizing. And I put the principles in writing. And they in part were principles that I had learned from reading Antonio Gramsci, who wrote a book called Strategy for Labor. And it provided if the youth movements of the 60s in some ways hoped for a social revolution, this provided a strategy for non-reformist reforms. That was one way it was talked about. And the three key principles was that you actually, based on our values, you want to improve people's lives. So this is about that, which actually was novel for some. Oh, you mean you're not just for democracy, justice, freedom. You actually want to improve lives. Okay, well, that was rooting it in real change. The second was that you give people a sense of their own power. So it's not just winning things for others, but people are part of the struggle. That's the direct action component, and they feel they've won it themselves. And the third is you get structural change. You build organizations that hold those in power more accountable, and you have a restructuring of power that build non-reformist reforms that move you towards a better place in the society. So an example, cameras on police is a very good reform. It exposes what's there. A police civilian review board is a non-reformist reform in that it gives power to a community to review budgets, to review policies. And the Action Committee for Decent Childcare became an embodiment of that, with winning $1 million for childcare as a concrete improvement. We won it through direct action, lots of stories about that. And then we won a parent-client review board that could review the policies. So it put it into practice.
Right.
And one way to advance those ideas, I helped to initiate a paper that was written by about 5 of us called Socialist Feminism. And we circulated that paper. Again, this was before the internet. And we built socialist feminist women's organizations, maybe in 20 places around the country, and would go around the country and talk about it. So that brings me to 73 and the forming of the Academy and the first class of the Academy. Oh, I had gone through the Industrial Areas Foundation. I was, I think, the third woman who went through. Many of them had come out of church traditions and the Jesuits. So they were men largely that Alinsky had helped to organize and had initiated. And I learned a great deal from them, but they also, to toughen me up, I now realize, they challenged me. And so at the last section of the training session, each person had, I don't know, 15 minutes to describe their story. And then I was the last person, and I kept saying, I'm willing to tell my story about the organizing I'm doing. And in some ways, I was doing the Action Committee for Decent Childcare then.
Right.
Maybe this was 71.
Okay.
My husband had been the co-chair of the Alinsky organization in Chicago with Father Len Doobie. And so that was an Alinsky organization. It was the first metropolitan multiracial organization, as opposed to one community that would be only one race. So it was a pretty remarkable development. And they were winning victories. I also had this Action Committee for Decent Childcare, was also winning victories.
Right.
And in the session, maybe there were 30 people in the session, I kept offering to tell my story and about my organizing. And they said, no, let's wait till after lunch. I was the only person left. And after lunch, they spent the entire time, I felt, as an attack. Women can't be organizers.
Oh my God.
Women aren't organizers. why are you doing that? Why? And I said, and I'm crying in front of this mostly men's group.
Oh, God.
And I'm saying, what about Dolores Huerta? What about Fannie Lou Hamer? What about maybe Grace Lee Boggs? What about the woman who started Catholic Worker? I mean, I was just trying to.
Right. Dorothy Day, right.
Dorothy Day, I remember raising that. And anyway, and then afterward, I went to them and I said, I think you're missing something. We can join together. I think you should need another perspective here. They rejected it. And I used that money to set up Midwest Academy, which was initially to train women organizers in the context of this and an emerging women's movement. And we tried to embolden a women's movement and provide additional strategic direction with deeper power bases in grassroots organizing. We helped to create working women's organizations, supported 9 to 5, who had organizers in our first class, helped to support the creation of Women Employed. My closest friend in Chicago, Dave Creamer, now Dave Piercy, was the founder of that, and Kate Blunt, who worked for them also, and a network of working women's organizations that later became 9 to 5. And then we worked with NOW and other groups. There was WHEEL, there were other women's groups that were starting at the same time. There's Stewardesses for Equal Rights, who provided one of the first cases that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission wouldn't take up. And because they wouldn't take it up, it's one of the reasons NOW was formed, one of many reasons, when the Equal Opportunity Commission wasn't responsive to women as well as to race. And we worked with NOW to build a campaign against Sears Roebuck. Right. NOW had a lawsuit against Sears. You couldn't get a credit card in your own name, and the women who worked at Sears were selling, you got a percentage of what you sold. And so the men could sell the brown goods like furnaces, and you got a percentage, refrigerators. And women could sell notions and ribbons and candy, and you got a percentage. Which one made more money?
What do you think?
And so we thought if we took Sears as a target, this allowed us to create a worker community consumer alliance, have a women's focus, and also be broader. There's a Sears in every community. There was a lawsuit going on. We could have this campaign. Mary Jean would be our heroine. She was the champion. She knew about organizing. We'd support her. And then on the basis of that, we thought, as there was an opening for the presidency, catapult her to the presidency of now. Mary Jean is more of that story, where basically Sears Roebuck stole the election, and in my view, changed the course of the women's movement, not for the better. And I believe that there could have been a self-conscious race-class alliance at an early point in the women's movement that was guided by the needs of women's lives and less of abstraction of equality, as important as that is, and as important as the vision is.
Right.
And
right.
I think it's one of the unfortunate turning points of the women's movement, and Mary Jean still has my loyalty. Ann Ladke, who was then working for years, was the director of Women Employed, was the campaign manager for Mary Jean's campaign. I was an advisor, and I've loved Mary Jean and Ann Ladke and others since then. So the movements of the 60s are starting to crash, though the women's movement and the environmental movement are going full bore, and a consumer movement with Nader is going full bore.
Yes.
So we create a training center that's designed both to pass on strategic planning skills, strategic planning of how to think about strategy in this new period,
Right.
to pass on the skills of organization.
Right.
When many groups don't know, how do you even have a meeting? How do you, like you were saying, how do you create publicity for an earth-shaking event or
Right.
whatever?
I mean, incredible, right?
And then also a strategic planning center to design strategies for the new period. And so we created a number of new organizational thrusts, 9 to 5, working women's movements beyond 9 to 5, that was one.
Right.
Created an alliance to build a unity between labor and community groups that had been broken by, after the McCarthy era, the Citizen Labor Energy Coalition. I tried 2 other issues that could do it, but that was the one. And then created Citizen Action, which was the model of statewide multi-issue grassroots organizations.
Right.
And some other things. It became a center. We had an annual retreat, which would gather the forces of the progressive movement together. At our height, we had 2,000 people at our height of the retreat,
Right.
and almost all of the Democratic candidates came.
Right.
By 1980, Reagan is elected. I realized we need to do politics. I give a talk, left with a ballot box. And I decided to learn about elections that I had thought were such a corrupted arena. I wasn't sure that it was the arena I wanted to operate in.
Right.
But I decided, as Alice Palmer says, if you don't do politics, politics does you.
Perfect.
So I learned a lot about elections. I set up a national organization to train people in how you do elections, and hired Sophie Ann Aoki and Paul Tully and Gina Glantz, who went around the country, and we helped to train groups. I mean, we should remember not only NOW, but Sierra Club,
Right.
none of the groups did elections, not really.
No.
And then I also set
No.
up one of the largest voter registration efforts.
Mhm.
So this is 80
Yeah.
into the early 80s.
Right.
I became active in Chicago politics, was in the Mayor Washington campaign.
Right.
Working for Jackie Grimshaw, learned a lot about the discipline of ethical politics, where you treat people not based on patronage, but based on skill and do you do the work. And so that's 87.
Right.
I'm co-chair of Citizen Action. I was chair of Citizen Labor Energy Coalition. And then I did, I think, 3 years of international pro-democracy work. In 2000, I'm hired to run the advocacy arm of the NAACP through my relationship with Julian Bond, who I met through SNCC and the Civil
Right.
Rights Movement.
Right.
He's now the chair of the board of the NAACP. We
Right.
ran a $23 million program. And actually it was a $46 million program, because I had 23, they had 23. It was a great deal of money at that time.
Amazing.
We ran a disciplined operation. We had, I think, 15 or 17 key states. And to some ways spearheaded certain kinds of techniques that are now more commonly used. That was 2000.
Right.
I was hired to run a group to reinstill social justice into the heart of the Jewish community called Amos. And though it didn't survive, a lot of the Jewish social justice work came out of that is now flowering. Then I started to get recruited. Oh, I'm sorry. In 89, I came to Washington. 88, I came to Washington. I was hired to run the grassroots operation of the March for Women's Lives that had 1 million people around the country, or so we said, in activities around the country. I ran that, while Alice Cohan ran the DC one. But Bella Abzug ran the national coalition, and I was directing it. There's a whole set of stories with Bella.
Sure.
And then, so then 2000, and then I started to run large scale issue campaigns. I was hired to set up one of the early immigration reform campaigns, ran the campaign for financial reform, worked at the AFL-CIO, and I ran their healthcare campaign. I was hired by the National Committee to NCPSSM, National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, to run part of the campaign to save Medicare and Social Security, which was being undermined, privatized. I ran 10 years ago for the campaign for financial reform that won the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Dodd-Frank bill. I ran the marriage equality campaign around the Supreme Court decision, working out of the task force. And what happened is, because I wasn't necessarily in the community, the ways in which people know each other's stuff when you're in the community,
Right.
and might have made enemies with others. I didn't have enemies, and I wasn't pushing any agenda.
Right.
So I could
beyond whatever you
let everyone get the respect they wanted. I didn't need the attention. So I ended up running a lot of these campaigns. I was the senior advisor to the campaign for immigration reform with the Alliance for Citizenship, and ran the campaign to stop the Trump tax cuts. And then four and a half years ago, my husband died. Big life change.
Huge.
A movie had been made about my life in organizing, and where I put my energies was I went around the country for 3 years after Trump is elected to promote the film, which in part is promoting a women's and a movement agenda, with the main thrust were those lessons from the civil rights movement of that if you organize, you can change the world. I've added, you need to do it with love at the center. You need to stand up to illegitimate authority and listen to people. And that film, Heather Booth, Changing the World, it was shown on PBS and World Channel. There were a couple of other films, She's Beautiful When She's Angry. And then I did the progressive and seniors outreach for the Biden campaign. Oh, did I say that I worked at the DNC from?
You haven't yet.
I worked at the DNC from 1989. So I moved to DC in 88 or 89.
Right.
Oh, no. It was after I went back to Chicago. I ran the field operation for Caramel Z. Braun. I was doing a lot of elections. In 93, after Clinton is elected,
right,
I went to the DNC. I did many different things there. I did women's outreach. I initiated the idea of called the Women's Leadership Forum, which they've completely forgotten. It's now a fundraising arm. But I did the labor outreach. I did many kinds of outreach, and then I became the training director. And then I did the outreach for the Hillary healthcare plan. And then I became the training director. So that was 93, 94, terrible election. 95, I became the training director, and I did that till 98.
Right.
So that was just another thing in there. And then I started to run statewide coordinated campaigns, or parts of them, in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New Mexico, and other places. I was running statewide coordinate. Illinois, I did twice. New York. So that pretty much brings us, so that I insert the DNC stuff because I forgot that, but then, and then I ran the outreach for the Biden campaign, Progressive and Seniors Outreach.
Right.
We set up an extraordinary operation in 17 states. And then since then, I took on a role. I was strategic advisor for a campaign to advise Demand Justice that was on addressing the Supreme Court and its problems before it became as notable as it is now.
Yeah.
And then worked on a campaign to tax the ultra wealthy and have that included in the Build Back Better effort.
Mhm.
I'm still working on that. There's some hope that something will still be passed. And
Keep hope.
and now, and then I run as a continuation of the work on the outreach of the Biden campaign. There's a twice a week progressive mobilization call that I assist in the hosting. Bob Creamer runs, who's been my friend since Chicago days. We 3 families bought a house together so that we could raise our kids together. Margaret Schmidt, Bob and Day Creamer, and Paul and me. And then, and Bob and I have stayed partners. We're in a group that he really initiated called Democracy Partners. It's a political consulting firm. And that's an interesting website. I mean, it's interesting people in it. And then, so there's this twice a week call, Mondays and Thursdays at 2. I'm still working on Build Back Better. I give a lot of advice to different organizations. And I'm doing now, particularly with the HBO film on Jane that's come out,
Right.
the Janes, I was doing like 2 press calls a day. Now it's more like 1 a day or 3 times a week, though it may pick up again. And I'm probably doing 10 talks a week of different groups, indivisible chapters, pro-choice groups, groups in different states, with, and often now when I say, so what do you want me to speak on? The most common answer is we want you to inspire people into action because people are so dispirited. So I've written a memo on 10 reasons why we still can win, but it all is based on, do we organize? And those 3 lessons of the civil rights movement, that if you organize, you change the world, but only if you organize.
And if you
have to
don't, you don't.
sometimes stand up to illegitimate authority, and you have to trust and listen to what real people need and want and care about. And then these are my 2 watchwords that I made these buttons in the Biden campaign. I told you about this, that one was, we have to organize. See, it says Biden Harris at the bottom, and the other is with love at the center.
I love it.
So those are my watchwords. So that's where I am. I have 2 grown children in their 50s. I'm both very proud of them and think they're pretty remarkable, very ethical people who with shared values.
Mhm.
I have 5 grandchildren. Here's a picture of the grandchildren. They're a big part of my life.
And there they are.
The oldest just graduated from high school. I do a weekly call with my kids. We do a monthly call with my family and my other family. I do a weekly call with the grandkids. I do a every other week call with different family sets. So family is a big part of my life.
Good.
Friends are a big part of my life. Here's a list of 14 people who are frail or
Wow.
in need of support. And I'm trying to stay in touch with them as we are all in need of support. I'm going to have very extensive foot surgery that will be a year's recovery, 6 months of intense pain, 3 months of where I can't walk on my foot.
Ooh.
And we're all aging, so trying to deal with that.
Yeah.
I have regular friend calls. I have a call with Vivian and Amy every month. I have a call with my two best friends from high school every month. I have a periodic call with this very good friend from camp. I mentioned Annie Popkin.
Yeah.
So I both have, I see Mary Jean and Jane Plitt every now and then. I mean, so I've got regular intense friend networks. I'm in 3 theater series, so I see some friends going to theater. There are 3 different series. One is Shakespeare with Celinda Lake and Kathy Hurwitz. One is Mosaic, the sort of modern theater with 2 other friends. And then the Arena Stage with 2 other friends who are also very good friends of Paul's. Anyway, and I've got these 2 book clubs that I'm in, have been in for 35 years. So I feel I've got a very rich life. Often too much is going on. But I'm very grateful for my life. And I'm grateful to know Mary Jean Collins.
I'm grateful to know you. I wanted to go back and ask about that book that you were wanting to write 30 years ago. Will that book ever be written? It sounded like an interesting book.
I'm not going to write it. Here was one main thrust that I had.
Right.
That there are at least 3 ways to respond to the fundamental, the insight that women especially, young people especially, women in particular, but I think all people want to be loved and want to be recognized.
Right.
And feel we are not necessarily good enough and beat up on ourselves for that.
Right.
And there are 3 main ways that I saw that at least women respond to it. One was as a victim, and then you can't move forward. You say, I really am not good enough.
Right.
The second is as a bully. And you decide, I did it, you could do it.
And that describes our opposition.
And then the third is that you create sisterly leadership. And I wrote a paper on sisterly leadership, of what it means to create a sisterhood that reflected the feelings of the civil rights movement. We called it a beloved community. It was the sense of sisterhood that I felt was a joy in whatever's written. I don't know that I went into this enough, but the joy of finding other people who were so smart and made you feel smart.
Totally.
And were so positive about life and made you feel positive about life. And wanted to take action, not just to talk, but to do things. The joy of being in a women's movement like that was just one of the greatest joys of my whole life.
Me too.
And so that was going to be the thrust of the book. And it's in almost every talk that I give. And no matter what the subject, let's say my subject was healthcare, but it could be anything. If I mention this in the talk, and I often do, the thing that people wanted to talk with me about after the talk was about insecurity and feeling not good enough and how do you survive.
Wow.
And it's certainly what all the women want to talk about. It's the most notable thing about the talks I give, whatever, Social Security.
Whatever it is, right.
Whatever it is. And one example, when I was running this large mobilization, the countrywide mobilization, we thought 1 million people came out. So Bella Abzug's the head of it. This is after I was going to do the paper, but it's just one key example that really the light bulbs went off in my head. So I was working night and day. Bella is very demanding. I did everything I think she could want. She'd often call me up like at 1 or 2 a.m. with a new idea. I'd try and do everything. We had a meeting of the board, and the board was of all the women's organizations that themselves were very contentious. She had again called me up at 1 or 2 a.m. We had a final plan. We had a plan going into the meeting. She was chairing the meeting, but I staffed it, so I had the major reports.
Mhm.
And in the middle of the meeting, an idea occurred to her, or it occurred to her between 2 a.m. and then. And she raised it and she wanted to know why I hadn't done something that we had never discussed before.
Oh,
And she rammed me about it.
in
How
front,
the hell could you not have done this? Why didn't you do this?
is this in front of the whole meeting?
In front of the whole meeting.
Oh,
It was a conference call, but it was a, so
Okay.
I'm sitting there, I'm crying on the phone. I've done everything I can. I'm totally exhausted. The march is, the day is coming up. So many things have been wonderful.
yes.
So I'm with tears in my eyes. I gather myself after the call. I call her up and I say, this is how you treated me. You will never treat me like this again, or I won't be here. I don't deserve to be treated this way.
Good.
You should not treat me this way. You should not treat anyone this way. At which point, I think she may have been crying, or at least she became very vulnerable.
Okay.
And she said, totally softened. She didn't say she's sorry, but she said, you don't know how I've been treated my whole life. I've been kicked in my gut. I've been kicked in my head. I've been called such terrible things. I've had to swallow my pride. I've been made to eat shit. And so I learned you have to be so tough to get ahead. And I said, you also need to be kind to get ahead. I said, and I live in a world where I want kindness. I want to treat people kindly. I want to be treated kindly. And from then on, we were extremely close, caring friends. She treated me almost like a daughter.
Good.
Now, this was 1989.
Mhm.
I don't remember when she died. It wasn't much longer. She lived in New York. I was in DC at that point.
Right.
So we didn't see each other a lot, but we had an affinity. But it also raised this lesson to me
The bully response.
of the bully, because you yourself feel so vulnerable.
Mhm.
And you yourself are so mistreated.
And she had that reputation, and the more she behaved like that, the more people pushed her away. I mean, it's just such a self-defeating way to behave, right? I mean,
And Betty had some of those characteristics.
definitely Betty had them, definitely.
And you know, with Betty, partly I really do believe kindness is one of the things we need to do. It's like I got into abortion work, not out of ideological commitment, but of wanting to do a good deed for a friend.
Yes.
With Betty Friedan, who I didn't know, except I met her through you.
Right.
But when she was living in DC, and many of her friends had disappeared or died,
Mhm.
or she had alienated them,
Right.
and she herself was quite frail.
Right.
I think she was on a walker. I'm trying to remember exactly. And Hildy, was it Hildy?
Mhm.
Who was her assistant. So I would talk with Betty or see her or take her out to lunch, just on a friendship basis. I'm not, and she wanted to have a role within the women's movement. She'd say, where's the young leaders of today? And,
Yeah.
but it was mostly just as a friend. Anyway, I've tried to do that with a number of people.
I can't even imagine you're trying to do this, but is there anything that stands out as the major accomplishment that you want to be remembered for? There's so many of them.
I would want to be remembered as someone who built other people's confidence in themselves. I've had many assistants and people I've worked with
Mhm.
who have gone on to wonderful careers,
Mhm.
who I feel I value my work with them.
Right.
They've been wonderful to me.
Right.
I think creating a systematic way of looking at organizing that addresses issues of power and not just demonstrating. I think looking at organizing as a way to transform the world because the three principles, I actually think that's been a contribution I've made. I have people all the time who say that they've adopted it or it influenced them, that they've gone on to very different kinds of work. To an extent, the model of my own life, that when I was young, I decided I would be in this for the rest of my life. And that on the trip I took to Israel, on seeing the Holocaust Museum in Israel, when I was 17, on seeing the Warsaw Ghetto aspect of the memorial, I said, in the face of injustice, I'll struggle for justice, and do it for my whole life. It wasn't just going to be a summer or when I was young, but I do it my whole life. And so I figured out some ways, inadequately, a little bit crazy, but ways to have a balance in life so that I could continue my whole life. So it meant spending time with friends, having a long-term relationship and putting time into that relationship. It's not easy to live with someone else, even when you love each other. But you have to think about it. You can't take it for granted. Trying to cultivate and support friendships, even when I don't have a lot of time. I never feel I have enough time to engage as I want to. It means taking vacations. It means now I try to schedule, when can I have a nap? My favorite thing in the world, taking a nap. But so I think that's important. So having a life in the movement, building caring relationships, being kind. I believe we should treat people with dignity and respect, and even build a movement with divergent ideas I don't 100% share, but as long as I feel they're not destructive, it's part of what we either learn from or part of the movement. One dynamic I had, one of many things I haven't mentioned, I'm sure, is when I had conflict with someone in the movement, I would go out of my way to try and become friends with them or very good friends, some of whom I've stayed friends with for many years. I'm aware of the disagreement, and sometimes I'm aware of very unkind, unjust, or unfair things I think they've done. So I'm mindful, because I feel they could always do this again, but I go out of my way to try and be in relationship with them if they are committed overall to trying to build a movement, however it means to them. And I have a fairly long list of people like that. And really the theme of organizing, it's not one issue. The women's movement, which really helped form me, reflects my values. Civil rights movement, anti-war movement, I didn't even really address that. I've been arrested, I don't know, 8 or 10 times, one first with civil rights, against the war in Vietnam, a labor struggle. I was the first non-mine worker to say I'd go to Pittston for the mine worker strike when we were asked to do that, and forced Lane Kirkland to be involved in his first civil disobedience that he ever was involved with in his life. The whole alliance with the labor movement, discuss that. I was arrested with Jane Fonda on the climate more recently. I was arrested in a money and politics one. I was arrested in, I think 3 immigration ones. And there was one, Jews for Dreamers. And that was the day that my husband died, he wanted me to go off. I did the demonstration, came back, and was in his room as he got his final infusion for cancer infusion, which then killed him. So anyway, those are all different parts alike, but it's not one thing. It's the concept that if we organize, we can change the world. We need to, with love at the center, with a lifelong commitment that cares about ourselves, that cares about others, that acknowledges the insecurity and vulnerability that we have, and finds ways to gain greater strength through our friendships and our shared commitment and work. It is how I really try to live, imperfectly. You know, just thinking about my weaknesses, which are myriad. Because I'm insecure, it gets up and messes me up all sorts of times. There are times I'd give a speech, I wouldn't recognize someone because I thought, who am I to recognize that person because I'm so little? And the person was hurt.
Oh, for God's sake. Okay.
And I've done versions of that many times. People are sitting at a table. I don't want to sit in the middle of the table because why would anyone want to sit near me? I'll sit near the end, but then someone says, why didn't you sit there? And I mean, it's nuts. The number of people I'm not responsive enough to. I don't see enough. I don't talk to enough. I don't engage enough. I feel I don't do enough. But there's one, I wanted to give one example also on these weaknesses. In one part of the women's liberation movement in Chicago, there was a period where the left was infected with something called criticism, self-criticism. And at the end of the meeting, out of a good initial thought, you say, how did the meeting go? I'm for debriefs. I'm for briefing, action, and then debrief, always.
Right.
But in the debrief, you have to say, how did the meeting go? And self-criticism of what you did that was not good in the meeting.
Oh, God.
But then many people used it to get you,
Bad.
to say, well, you cut me off. But it was not kind. It was so severe after we had this vote in the Women's Liberation Union to deal with sectarian attempt to take over the union.
Right.
If anyone could come in and vote, it mean you could,
right,
pull people off the street who weren't invested, and they basically wanted to use the structure we had to recruit for their own sectarian party. And because they had sectarian, this was Progressive Labor and Socialist Workers Party,
right,
because they were disciplined political organizations, and we did not have that tradition,
right,
and skill and background. If you come in and you're a disciplined force and everyone's going to say the same thing, you can more get your way if you're against people who aren't.
right.
So having won the fight to allow the rules that we would have what I think is a more structural democratic organization,
Right.
where you had to be part of it, you had to be in a work group in order to vote, things like that.
Right.
And we adopted the socialist feminism paper.
Mhm.
And in doing it, people felt bent out of shape. And so there was a period of criticism, self-criticism, and I hadn't been skillful enough to know how to make people feel part of it. Again, I had, I had 2 kids, I had a job, I had, I wasn't full-time staff on this. And I wasn't skillful enough to know how to do it. I learned lessons from this.
Sure.
So I felt I was going to be driven insane. And I told Paul that if I'm driven insane from this endless self-criticism, self-criticism, and I'd keep going back to the meetings to get self-criticism or criticism, that he shouldn't give up on me, that he should give me 3 years. I will come out of this. But that's how brutal the movement itself could be to ourselves. So it's not like, I'm partly mentioning it, I didn't want to give an impression of a movement and a life that is endlessly joyful. So much is joyful. I do want to convey that. I wouldn't have stayed in this work if not.
Right.
But everything from the, I'm in SNCC. Whites are thrown out of SNCC because it makes sense then for African Americans to find their own voice in their own organization.
Mhm.
The women's union fractures. I no longer can be there. SGS fractures. I can no longer be there. I'm in the labor organizing drive. It's destroyed over anti-communism. I still decide to stay with the labor movement. And other efforts that happened like this. So that there's been also a life of internal struggle. I've tried to learn from those struggles the importance of both taking responsibility, that all of things happened partly because I wasn't skillful enough to know how to deal with it. And what are the things that I have to learn at each point? I tried to learn from, even if I didn't cause the problem, what could have been done so that we didn't have the problem? What could I learn? The second thing is just the value of being kind to each other, because we all make mistakes.
We do.
When people make mistakes, it's not common that I get angry because we all make mistakes. I do then immediately go into, and what do we do about it?
Mhm.
If I feel I can turn that anger into action,
Mhm.
it's why I don't often get depressed. Things are sad, are rough, are not winning.
Right.
But I try and figure out, how do we move forward? And I think it's one of the important lessons for how to survive in this for the long haul, especially in a period that's very difficult.
Right.
And very challenging, and also to be kind to each other. And as much as I do, say, oh,
Yeah.
Just this morning, something happened. I had to give an interview. It was a very important interview. It was an MSNBC interview on Morning Joe, but I got notified of it when I was in New York because I was doing something else. And I did it on an iPad that couldn't stand up. So in the interview, the iPad's going like this, or I'm going like this. So it was on this morning. I think it looks horrible. So I'm on Morning Joe this morning. I think it looks horrible. And I'm thinking to myself, how could I do that? How could I look so, it's literally like I'm going like this.
Right.
On the interview. And here, anyway, I just think it looks horrible. So my first reaction is, how could I do this? And several people then wrote in and said, I saw you on Morning Joe. My first reaction is, oh, I thought I looked horrible. I don't mean just like pretty or not pretty. I mean,
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
And I can't even, the light wasn't right. So it looks like, anyway,
Yeah.
not good. So I then got on myself, and then I realized that's not the right reaction.
Not.
I got on, people won't even remember what I looked like. They'll mostly remember that I was on, if they remember at all.
Right.
And that was helpful because it was about Jane
good.
and about
That's good.
the Roe decision. So I'm just giving examples of how I fall victim to the same weaknesses that we all do. I've got my own version. But I do believe that the movement makes us strong. And we need to find ways to stay together, value each other, value our relationships and a movement to make this a better world. Because Mary Jean, just to tell you, this quilt behind me is a quilt I was given on Valentine's Day of this year, February 14th. 4 women showed up at my door with this quilt. They called me before. And they are in a group called Wrapped in Love for Justice. And a wonderful woman named Cassandra McKee had helped form this group of quilters. And each square represents a square of my life in organizing. One is Action Committee for Decent Childcare, one is Chicago Women's Liberation Union.
Beautiful.
But there are other things. This is a quote from Amanda Gorman. This is what Paul said, my husband said when he met me at the sit-in at the University of Chicago. Can I sit here? So each one, though,
Wonderful.
is a square of my life.
Beautiful.
And it gives a sense of just the breadth, and it's called Wrapped in Love for Justice. I was the second quilt they made. It took 6 months for 20 women working on it.
Wow.
And the first quilt was given to Dolores Huerta.
Good company.
So I love that quilt. But
Yeah.
it also says there are a lot of squares in my life. Thank you for doing this, Mary Jean.
Of course. I'm thrilled to do it. I'm enjoying it, every minute of it. So
Well, you were a
just-
key part of this history.
well, aren't we lucky? We're so lucky. That's the lucky part of being part of this movement, right? The lucky part. Love you. All right.
Love you.
Good
Bye-bye.
stuff.